All right, everybody, welcome to lesson number 8 in the Political Science video blog series here at Politics with Roger. Thank you very much for coming back and checking out these lessons. We're moving right along here. Lesson number 8 is going to be about an overview of the Bill of Rights, our amendments that are given to us. There's some overlap in this lesson with the lesson about constitutionalism in 1776, lesson number 6 and 7, and some overlap also with lesson number 2, politics from the right. But you may recall that every American citizen is given a set of inalienable rights that were endowed by our Creator, that are said to be from our Creator, not from man. And we were given these rights are protected through our Bill of Rights that came into effect when the United States Constitution was ratified in 1789 and went into effect and became the law of the land. So just a quick overview. Now, the next 4 lessons after this one, we're going to break down specifically the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment. I believe these are the most relevant amendments for contemporary America, and we're going to spend a little bit more time with those with their own separate lessons in the upcoming lessons in this video blog series. So right now we're just going to kind of skim over the Bill of Rights and talk about some of the more maybe relevant ones. And obviously, as always, if you want to leave a comment and raise other amendments that I may have left out of the discussion and you want to bring up, we can talk about it in the comments. So I'm just going to point out a few of them now, and we can talk about that. Just a note that the original Bill of Rights had 10 amendments, and now we're up to 27 amendments about 250 years later after the birth of our country. So the first amendment that I wanted to point to was the Fifth Amendment, which is the right to not self-incriminate yourself. It's your right to have due process, which is a very important concept. We talked a little bit about due process in the philosophers and philosophies lesson. Due process is that for you to go to jail or for you to be found guilty of a crime, that there's a process that you have to go through. You can't just, it's not, the government can't just throw you in jail and say that you're guilty and then that's the end of it. You have a right to a trial. You have a right to a grand jury. That's specifically what the Fifth Amendment was about. You may have, as far as self-incrimination, you may have heard people in the movies or on TV say, "Oh, I plead the Fifth, I plead the Fifth." Actually, you might have heard people say that on C-SPAN in congressional hearings, where people exercise their Fifth Amendment right to not self-incriminate themselves, to basically stay silent in a court of law and allow the attorneys to do all the arguing. So that's the Fifth Amendment. Sixth Amendment, it basically gives you the right to a speedy and public trial. Again, this is important because, look, we don't know what it's like in America to live in a country where your government can just throw you in jail or the police can just throw you in jail and leave you there indefinitely and say, well, we'll give you a trial in 4 years or 5 years. We don't even think about that being a possibility because we have the right to a speedy and public trial here in the United States, and thank God for that. Because this doesn't exist in countries all around the world. Not in every country has that kind of protection for the average citizen, and it's very, very important. Your right to a speedy and public trial. The Sixth Amendment also gives us the right to an impartial jury and the right to a grand jury. We talked about this a little bit in philosophers and philosophies of constitutionalism. It's very important that we have a trial by jury of our peers. It's not like the Los Angeles Police Department arrests you and then you go on trial and it's a bunch of Los Angeles police officers who will be judging you. Now, nothing against Los Angeles police officers. I mean, I'm sure they'd be fair. Maybe they wouldn't be fair. I mean, I'm just, that's not fair to say about them. But the point is that a trial jury by peers is much more fair and unbiased, at least in principle. Maybe not in application, but at least in principle. And that's those are rights given to us by our Sixth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, no excessive bail. Again, our rights are protected. Our government can't just throw us in jail, leave us in jail, tell us, well, we'll have a trial next year, but we'll let you out, but your bail's $10 million. They're not allowed to do that. These are rights that we have. Now, I want to say something about rights that could have been mentioned before, because many of you might be thinking, wait a minute, I can think of instances where this person's rights were violated, or I read a story about this happening and this doesn't sound like that person's rights were respected. The thing about rights is if you don't exercise them, you lose them. We talked a little bit about this in the very first lesson, formal versus the informal. It can be hard to draw solid lines about where your rights start and end. And if you don't fight for your rights, if you don't exercise your rights, chances are you can lose your rights. So, when we talk about some of these rights, and if you're thinking to yourself of instances that seem like a person didn't have those rights, or maybe you had those rights taken away, what I would say is that we must, as a citizenry, always be exercising our rights, or we risk losing them. Just one note about cruel and unusual punishment. I know that there are people out there that argue putting people in jail for many years is cruel and unusual punishment. Now, they're not saying that people who commit horrible crimes shouldn't be punished. Some have suggested lashes and that kind of thing, physical punishment as an alternative. But I think it's an interesting argument, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I won't go down that rabbit hole, but people are out there that say that, that maybe throwing people in jail for many, many years it can be considered cruel and unusual. But anyway, moving on. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, these were considered the Civil War amendments. These were the amendments that were written and put into law immediately after the Civil War, after the North defeated the South. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment granted slaves citizenship and equal protection. There was something called, in the 14th Amendment, the principle of selective incorporation. And I can't chase that rabbit right now either, but that's a fascinating discussion to have. We'd have to have that at a later time in an upper level of political science class. But it gets into this whole issue of ownership between the federal government and the states, and it gets to be a fascinating discussion. Maybe you can net search at the principle of selective incorporation and how that was applied. It's a little bit of a tricky sleight of hand, but I guess what I'll say about it is the federal government power increased a lot after the 14th Amendment was implemented, and the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. The 17th Amendment was the first time senators were finally directly elected by the people. In other words, up until 1912, which was also an interesting time in our history because the Federal Reserve was implemented in 1913, and there were a lot of things going on about the structure and organization of our country around that time. But American citizens actually didn't elect their senators until 1912. Before that time, it was the states and the state legislatures that would appoint the state senators that would go to Washington, D.C. And if you recall from your civics class, each state has 2 state senators. And the House of Representatives, the number of representatives from a state that go to the House of Representatives depends on the population of the state. So a state like California has, a lot of members to the House of Representatives, where a state like Alaska has very few. But every state has 2 state senators, equal representation in that sense. So it's an interesting system, and it's an interesting checks and balance that takes place there. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and the 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. This was in 1971. The previous age to vote was 21. But the thought at the time was there's a war going on in Vietnam, and many 18-year-olds were being drafted to go into war. And the thought was, the argument was, and it's a good argument, it's like, hey, how can you draft someone to go into war, and then you're going to tell these people that we're not even going to give you a voice in our voting system? That seemed wrong, so that was the 26th Amendment. So again, just a quick overview. We're going to be covering again the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and 10th Amendment in much more detail in the upcoming lessons. And by the way, just if you don't know, that's your freedom of speech. Your First Amendment, your Second Amendment is your right to bear arms. Your Fourth Amendment is basically your right to privacy and prevents illegal search and seizure. And your 10th Amendment is an amendment that empowers states to exercise their power. So we're going to be talking about those in more detail in the upcoming lessons. If you think I missed an important amendment or you want to have a discussion about that, go ahead and leave that in the comments. Again, thank you for checking out the Political Science video blog series here at Politics with Roger, and we'll see you guys again soon. All right.